5 Azure cost mistakes we see in every audit. Welcome back. Today's topic is 5 Azure cost mistakes we see in every audit. We'll cover what you actually need to know about Azure cost optimization. Now, moving on to mistake 1, skipping the Azure infrastructure assessment. Most teams migrate to Azure with a reasonable plan, then skip the structured assessment that would tell them if that plan is actually working. The Azure infrastructure assessment isn't a sales activity. It's a diagnostic. It tells you which workloads are consuming compute they don't need, which storage tiers are mismatched to access patterns, and where network egress is quietly adding hundreds of dollars per month. A thorough Azure infrastructure assessment surfaces 3 categories of waste that are nearly invisible during normal operations. None of these problems show up on a dashboard unless someone is actively looking. And most teams aren't looking in year 1 because they're focused on getting workloads running, not on auditing what they provisioned 3 sprints ago. Next up, now, mistake 2, treating lift and shift to Azure as a strategy. Lift and shift to Azure is a migration tactic, not a strategy. It gets your workloads off on-premise hardware quickly, but it preserves every inefficiency those workloads had on physical servers and adds cloud-specific costs on top. We see this every time a company skips the modernization conversation to hit a data center exit deadline. The result is an Azure environment where applications run on D-Series VMs when App Service or Azure Container Apps would cost a fraction of that. The data center is gone. The problems moved with the workloads. A monolithic .NET application that consumed 8 cores on-premise will, after a lift and shift, continue consuming 8 cores on Azure, even if average utilization is 12%. Azure charges for provisioned capacity, not consumed capacity. That's a fundamental difference from on-premise economics, and most teams don't price it correctly before they migrate. Let's talk about mistake 3, skipping Azure cost optimization in your architecture review. The Azure architecture review is where teams should be catching compute mismatches before they become billing problems. Instead, most companies conduct architecture reviews at the design phase and skip them entirely at the 6 and 12-month operational checkpoints. Azure pricing changes. New VM families release. Reserved instance discount structures shift. An architecture that was cost-efficient at launch can drift significantly within a year without a structured review process. Nobody meant to let it drift. There just wasn't a calendar reminder to check. This is the single most common finding in any Azure cost optimization engagement: companies running workloads with predictable uptime on pay-as-you-go pricing. Now, next up, mistake 4, building without an Azure landing zone implementation. An Azure landing zone implementation is the governance scaffold that prevents your Azure environment from becoming a billing free-for-all. Without it, subscriptions multiply, resource groups sprawl, and cost visibility breaks down entirely. The specific version of this problem we see most often: a company starts with 1 subscription, adds a second for a project, a third for a business unit that wanted isolation, and within 18 months has 8 subscriptions with no tagging policy, no budget alerts, and no shared services hub. Nobody planned for this. It just grew. For a detailed breakdown of what landing zones actually do and how to implement them, Azure Landing Zones Explained for Midsize Companies covers the architecture in plain language. Let's talk about now, mistake 5, going without an Azure migration partner. This is the mistake that makes the other 4 worse. Azure is not a set-it-and-forget-it platform. It requires ongoing oversight, monitoring, optimization, reservation management, and architectural decision-making that responds to business changes. Companies that migrate on-premise to Azure without ongoing support typically see costs increase 20 to 35% in year 2, simply from organic growth combined with inattention to pricing changes and new service releases. The migration succeeded. The follow-through didn't. A proper Azure Managed Services provider doesn't just watch for uptime alerts. The monitoring scope should include. Next up, moving on to how Azure Cost Optimization Consulting changes the outcome. Azure Cost Optimization Consulting isn't about cutting tools or degrading service quality. It's about getting full visibility into what you're running, making deliberate decisions about reserved capacity, and building the governance layer that prevents future waste from accumulating. A structured engagement with a Microsoft Azure consulting company typically runs in 3 phases. A proper Azure security assessment isn't just a compliance exercise. Security misconfigurations often have direct cost implications: over-permissive storage accounts exposed to the internet, public endpoints on services that should be private, misconfigured diagnostic settings writing logs to the wrong storage tier. Next up, let's talk about conclusion. Azure cost optimization doesn't happen automatically, and it doesn't happen once. The 5 mistakes covered here: skipping the infrastructure assessment, treating lift and shift as a final destination, neglecting architecture reviews, building without a landing zone, and operating without managed oversight, each one is fixable. Most organizations need to address all 5, and most find that addressing them together delivers far more savings than tackling any single one in isolation. Q Services has been a Microsoft Azure consulting company since 2014, completing 500+ Azure and Microsoft platform projects across healthcare, logistics, financial services, and supply chain. Our Azure cost optimization consulting engagements typically reduce client spending by 25 to 40% within 90 days, without cutting services or degrading performance. If you're seeing unexpected Azure bills, the pattern is familiar and the fix is structured. Start with an Azure infrastructure assessment to find out exactly where your budget is going.